Picture this. It's the spring of 1892, and the morning train to Granite Falls, Colorado is about to deliver either a visionary or a fool. As the locomotive's whistle echoes off the towering granite peaks, Jacob Thornton steps onto the wooden platform, carrying a leather satchel that contains architectural drawings so audacious they would make modern engineers pause and cross themselves. Now, Jake Thornton wasn't your typical dreamer stumbling off a train with half-baked schemes. This 34-year-old engineer had cut his teeth in Pittsburgh's steel mills, where men learned to respect physics or die. For 2 solid years, he had obsessively studied wind patterns across the Rockies, collected avalanche data from every mining camp within 500 miles, and interviewed survivors of the world's harshest mountain disasters. He knew exactly what he was walking into, and that's what made what happened next so remarkable. The town's established guides had gathered at Murphy's Saloon to size up this outsider, who claimed he would build above 11,000 feet on Mount Desolation. Think about that altitude for a moment. We're talking about air so thin that every breath becomes a conscious effort, where temperatures can plummet 60 degrees in an hour, where the mountain doesn't just challenge you, it actively tries to kill you. And leading this skeptical crowd was Samuel Morrison, known as Steady Sam, to everyone in Granite Falls. Morrison was the kind of man who had guided wealthy eastern hunters safely through terrain that had claimed lesser guides. When Morrison spoke about the mountains, people listened. The confrontation at Murphy's was theatre, but Jake had scripted every scene. As Morrison spread his maps across the scarred wooden table, pointing to the death zones and impossible approaches, Jake listened with that slight smile you see on a chess master who's already thinking 5 moves ahead. Then he dropped his bombshell, a wager of $1,000, his entire life savings, that he would not only build on Mount Desolation, but live there year-round, right where Morrison's own brother had frozen to death 3 winters before. $1,000 in 1892. To put that in perspective, a skilled carpenter made maybe $800 in an entire year. Jake had just bet more than most men saw in their lifetimes on what everyone considered suicide. The saloon erupted like a dynamite charge. Men who had been nursing their whiskey suddenly found their voices, shouting odds, placing side bets, arguing about whether Jake was brilliant or insane. But here's the beautiful part. Jake's apparent madness spread through Granite Falls within hours, ensuring every supplier, every merchant, every person with goods to sell would know his name by sunset. Behind all that theatrical defiance, Jake had already secured mineral rights to the worthless peak for exactly $12. $12. He knew, something Morrison's maps didn't show. The southern face contained a thermal vent that would provide the crucial warmth difference between survival and becoming another cautionary tale whispered in mountain towns. His first ascent began at dawn on May 15th, and Jake made another calculated choice that revealed his true character. His only companion was Joseph Crow Feather, a Ute elder who was the single guide willing to risk his hard-earned reputation on the crazy white man's dream. Now, Joseph wasn't just any guide. He carried knowledge that had been passed down through generations who had called these mountains home when they were still young. As they climbed through air that grew thinner with each step, Joseph shared wisdom that no engineering school could teach. He showed Jake how to read the mountain's moods through subtle pressure changes that whispered of coming storms hours before they struck. He pointed out stress points in the granite that could support enormous weight and others that would crumble under a child's touch. He explained why certain stones sang warnings of instability when the wind struck them just right. Jake recorded every word in his journal, later writing that Joseph's wisdom was worth 10 engineering degrees from the finest universities in the East. Together, they identified the perfect site, a natural shelf protected by granite overhangs, positioned with the precision of a master sculptor to deflect avalanches while capturing maximum sunlight during the brief mountain summers. When they found it, Jake knew he had discovered something extraordinary, a partnership between human engineering and the mountain's own ancient wisdom. The return to town should have been triumphant, with Jake marching down Main Street like a conquering hero. Instead, he found that Morrison had poisoned every well that mattered. No supplier would sell materials to the dead man walking. Merchants who had been eager to hear his plans the day before suddenly found reasons to be busy when Jake appeared at their doors. Morrison had convinced them that selling to Jake was essentially profiteering from a man's funeral. Jake's response was nothing short of brilliant. Instead of fighting the boycott, he turned it into an opportunity that would make those same skeptics into his most invested supporters. He offered future exclusive guiding rights to his impossible cabin in exchange for materials and labor. Think about the psychology here. Jake was essentially saying, "You don't believe I'll succeed? Fine. Bet against me by helping me, and when I prove you wrong, you'll profit from my success." By June, he had signed agreements with 12 merchants who went from viewing him as a madman to seeing him as their investment. His calculated madness had become their calculated risk. The town that had gathered to watch a fool's errand was now financially tied to its success. As summer's brief window opened and Jake prepared to begin construction at an altitude where most men could barely think straight, Granite Falls buzzed with an energy that hadn't been felt since the first gold strikes. Every morning, people gathered with telescopes and field glasses, scanning the impossible heights where Jake Thornton planned to build his dream. But dreams built at 11,000 feet have a way of becoming nightmares faster than a summer storm. And Jake was about to discover that partnering with a mountain means accepting that your partner might try to kill you in the middle of the dance. Construction began during the brief mountain summer of 1892, and this is where Jake Thornton's true genius emerged, not through grand gestures, but through innovation born of absolute necessity. You have to understand the logistics nightmare he faced. How do you transport standard building materials to 11,200 feet when the nearest road ends at 7,000? How do you work with wood and metal when temperatures can swing from blazing sun to bone-chilling cold in the span of an afternoon? Most men would have looked at these problems and walked away. Jake looked at them and invented solutions that wouldn't be seen again for decades. Unable to haul conventional materials up slopes that would challenge a mountain goat, Jake developed a revolutionary building technique that combined Japanese temple joinery with Norwegian stave church design. Now, I want you to picture this. A Pittsburgh steel engineer sitting by lamplight in a canvas tent at 11,000 feet, sketching construction methods borrowed from cultures half a world away. Each log was individually selected from trees killed by lightning strikes, nature's own curing process that made the wood both resistant to rot and incredibly strong. Jake would spend entire days just listening to wood, tapping beams with a small hammer until he found ones that rang with the exact tone that would harmonize with the mountain's constant wind. Think about that for a moment. This man was tuning his building materials like a piano. But here's what makes it even more remarkable. Modern acoustic engineers have analyzed Jake's technique and discovered he was unconsciously selecting wood with specific resonant frequencies that would actually dampen destructive vibrations from wind and seismic activity. He was building earthquake and hurricane resistance into his cabin using nothing but his ear and intuition developed from years around industrial machinery. The pulley system Jake created became the stuff of local legend. Using natural granite spires as anchor points he had identified with Joseph Crowfeather's help, during their first ascent, Jake could single-handedly raise 500-pound beams through a complex series of mechanical advantages he calculated using nothing more than basic surveying equipment and principles learned in Pittsburgh's steel mills. Picture this. One man, working alone at an altitude where every breath is precious, hoisting massive timbers through the sky using nothing but rope, physics, and sheer determination. Martha Whitfield, a reporter from the Granite Falls Gazette, climbed partially up the mountain in August to document the impossible construction. Her description of seeing logs seemingly float upward, as if the mountain itself was assembling Jake's dream, captured imaginations far beyond Colorado. Her articles were syndicated to Denver, then picked up by papers in Chicago and New York. What had started as a local curiosity was becoming a national fascination. America in 1892 was hungry for stories of individual achievement, of men conquering impossible odds through ingenuity and will. Jake Thornton was becoming the embodiment of that frontier spirit. But the mountain wasn't going to let Jake have his victory without a fight. On September 23, 1892, nature delivered a test that nearly ended everything. A freak early blizzard struck with winds that modern meteorologists estimate exceeded 130 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, we're talking about hurricane-force winds at an altitude where the air is already thin enough to make thinking difficult. Jake was caught with walls half complete and roof barely started, essentially living in a construction site that was about to become a death trap. His decision in that moment reveals everything you need to know about Jacob Thornton's character. Using emergency supplies he had wisely stockpiled, he created a temporary shelter within the unfinished structure, essentially building a cabin inside his future cabin. For 3 days and nights, the mountain tried to kill him. Ice formed inside his improvised shelter. His water froze solid despite being near his body heat. On the second night, an avalanche that sounded like a freight train destroyed his eastern wall, filling half his workspace with tons of snow and debris. When the storm finally cleared, and the townspeople gathered around Morrison's telescope, they expected to see wreckage, another cautionary tale about the folly of challenging the high country. Instead, they witnessed something that defied all logic. Jake, emerging from what should have been his tomb, immediately beginning repairs with movements that observers described as having impossible certainty. But something fundamental had changed during those 3 days of survival. Jake was no longer building against the mountain, he was building with it. The avalanche had taught him the mountain's attack patterns, shown him exactly how the forces of wind and snow would assault his structure. He rebuilt differently, angling walls to deflect rather than resist, creating breakaway sections that would sacrifice themselves to save the core structure. He installed what he called pressure valves, small openings positioned with mathematical precision that would whistle warnings when wind loads reached dangerous levels. By November 1st, as winter locked the high country in its icy grip, Jake raised his roof beam in a ceremony witnessed by dozens of townspeople through telescopes. Martha Whitfield's headline read, "The Madman's House Stands Complete." Morrison publicly admitted he had lost the bet, though he warned that standing and surviving an entire winter are two very different things. Jake's response, delivered through Whitfield's column, became the stuff of legend. "The mountain and I have reached an understanding. It will test me, and I will endure. We are no longer enemies, we are dance partners." As the first snows began to fall and the last climbers descended to the safety of lower elevations, Jake Thornton settled in for what everyone assumed would be his final winter. The betting in Murphy's saloon wasn't whether he would survive, but how they would recover his body come spring. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in the annals of human endurance, a man who had learned to make the impossible heights of the Colorado Rockies his home. The real test was just beginning. The winter of 1893 to 94 transformed Jake Thornton from a local curiosity into something approaching myth. When temperatures plummeted to -52 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, and Jake not only survived but thrived, investigators started asking serious questions about how such a thing was possible. What they discovered defied everything they thought they knew about surviving at extreme altitude. Jake's brilliant thermal management system channeled heat from that hidden thermal vent through hollow spaces he had built into the cabin's walls, creating what modern engineers recognize as a passive geothermal envelope. But Jake's own explanation was beautifully simple. "The mountain's heartbeat keeps me warm." He had essentially turned his entire cabin into a living organism that breathed with the mountain itself, drawing warmth from the Earth's core and circulating it through spaces designed with a precision that wouldn't be matched by professional HVAC systems for another 50 years. Word of the impossible hermit spread through climbing circles like wildfire. Here was a man who had not just survived where others died, but who was apparently flourishing in conditions that should have killed him a dozen times over. The first pilgrim arrived in June 1894, and she changed everything about how people viewed Jake's mountain sanctuary. Eleanor Hastings was dying. Tuberculosis was consuming her lungs, and the best doctors in Boston had given her months to live. But Eleanor had heard whispers about the man on the mountain, stories of impossible survival that suggested something almost supernatural was happening at 11,000 feet. When she appeared at Jake's door, a society woman who had somehow climbed to heights that challenged experienced mountaineers, Jake's journal captures his complete bewilderment. She arrived at my door like she was visiting a saint, expecting miracles I never claimed to perform. Jake reluctantly allowed Eleanor to stay in a lean-to addition he built in a single day, working with the kind of focused intensity that comes from years of practice at high altitude. 6 weeks later, when Eleanor descended the mountain, something extraordinary had happened. Whether it was the pure air, the profound peace of the high country, or Jake's strange combination of practical wisdom and intuitive healing, Eleanor Hastings lived another 40 years. She spent the rest of her life crediting the mountain healer with her salvation, and her story drew others seeking their own impossible cures. But it was the rescue that occurred during the killer storm of February 1895 that truly cemented Jake's reputation as something beyond ordinary human capability. 3 experienced climbers from Denver, the McKenna brothers and their professional guide, had attempted a winter ascent despite warnings from every experienced mountaineer in Colorado. When the blizzard struck with the fury of an Arctic hurricane, they were presumed dead. Morrison was organizing a body recovery mission for spring when his telescope spotted something that shouldn't have been possible: a figure descending through the white hell, roped to 3 others. Jake had heard their distress whistles through the storm sounds that should have been impossible to detect over howling wind that stripped bark from trees. Using techniques Joseph Crow Feather had taught him about reading the mountain's acoustic properties, Jake triangulated their position and executed a rescue that modern mountaineers still study as tactically perfect. He navigated blind, through conditions that would challenge modern GPS systems, using wind patterns and the mountain's own sounds as his guide. The saved men's stories spread like wildfire through newspaper offices from Denver to New York. They spoke of Jake appearing through the blizzard like some kind of mountain spirit, of his cabin materializing through the white like a sanctuary conjured from their desperate prayers. They described the strange acoustics that allowed him to project his voice impossible distances, calling to them through the storm, with directions that led them to safety. Thomas McKenna, writing in the Denver Post, declared, "He is not mad. He has become something the mountain recognizes as kin." By year's end, Jake was receiving over 200 letters monthly from across the country. Many contained donations from people seeking prayers, advice, or simply wanting to support the guardian of the heights. Requests came from everywhere: mothers praying for sons lost in mining accidents, farmers facing drought, businessmen seeking wisdom about decisions that would affect thousands of lives. Jake answered every letter, his responses revealing a philosophy shaped by years of partnership with forces larger than human ambition. The transformation was remarkable. The engineer who had climbed the mountain seeking to prove human will could conquer nature had become something else entirely: a bridge between the civilized world and the eternal forces that shaped the high country. He wasn't fighting the mountain anymore, he was translating its lessons for those who would never experience them firsthand. Jake developed what he called his walking meditations, solo journeys across terrain that would challenge modern climbers with all their sophisticated equipment. During these expeditions, he accumulated knowledge of alpine conditions, weather patterns, and geological formations that represented data no university could have gathered. His detailed observations, recorded in journals that would eventually fill 47 volumes, became sought after by mining companies, weather services, and anyone trying to understand the complex systems that governed life at extreme altitude. The U.S. Weather Bureau officially contracted him as their high-altitude observer in 1900, paying him $200 annually for weather data so accurate it seemed almost supernatural. His forecasts, sent down monthly by a relay system he established with willing climbers, proved more reliable than instruments costing thousands of dollars. Jake had become a human barometer, so attuned to atmospheric changes that he could predict weather systems days before they appeared on the horizon. But perhaps most remarkably, Jake was happy. His letters from this period reveal a man who had found something most people spend their entire lives seeking: perfect harmony between who he was and where he belonged. The mountain had tested him with everything it possessed: cold, wind, avalanche, isolation, and he had not just survived but transformed those challenges into strengths. He had achieved something that philosophers write about but rarely experience: true integration with his environment. As Jake entered his middle years on the mountain, he had become living proof that human beings could adapt to seemingly impossible conditions through intelligence, preparation, and something harder to define: a willingness to become partners with forces most people only fear. Jake's final 20 years saw him evolve from hermit to institution, from curiosity to something approaching a force of nature himself. The weather data he provided proved so valuable that government agencies, mining companies, and railroad lines began planning major operations around his forecasts. His accumulated knowledge of alpine conditions, recorded with the methodical precision of a trained engineer, represented a database that universities would have killed for and that modern meteorologists still reference today. The cabin itself evolved during these years into something that transcended mere architecture. Jake's additions followed what he called dream logic, modifications that came to him during his walking meditations, structures that seemed to violate conventional building principles yet proved their worth when the mountain tested them. The whisper gallery he carved into the main room's ceiling created acoustic effects that modern scientists attribute to mathematically precise curves that Jake somehow intuited without formal training in acoustics. His star window, positioned according to what Jake described as a vision received during a 3-day solo journey in 1905, perfectly frames Polaris year-round, an astronomical impossibility that Jake achieved through complex calculations he claimed the mountain itself had provided. Visitors reported experiences they couldn't explain: hearing music in the wind that played through Jake's carefully positioned openings, finding answers to questions they hadn't yet asked, leaving the mountain changed in ways they couldn't articulate but couldn't deny. Dr. Harrison Wells, a professor of psychology from the University of Colorado, made the pilgrimage in 1908 specifically to debunk what he called the superstitious nonsense surrounding this elevated hermit. Wells spent 2 weeks on the mountain, conducting what he intended as scientific observation of Jake's supposed abilities. His final report, published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, stunned the academic community. Mr. Thornton has achieved a state of environmental integration that challenges our fundamental understanding of human adaptation. His ability to predict weather changes, navigate in zero visibility, and maintain psychological stability under conditions that would break most men suggests capabilities that we currently lack the scientific framework to explain. As Jake aged, he demonstrated the same strategic brilliance that had characterized his original ascent. Recognizing that his eventual death would leave a vacuum that could destroy everything he had built, he began preparing for continuity with methodical precision. In 1910, he established the Keepers of the Heights Trust, a legal framework that protected the cabin while creating a succession system designed to ensure his work would continue. His chosen heir was Marcus Wyndham, a young engineer from Chicago who had climbed the mountain in 1909 specifically to debunk the myths surrounding Jake's achievements. Marcus arrived as a skeptic, armed with modern instruments, determined to prove that Jake's weather predictions were lucky guesses and his survival skills were exaggerated, frontier folklore. Instead, he found himself face to face with capabilities that his engineering education couldn't explain. Jake spent 2 years teaching Marcus not just the practical skills needed to maintain the cabin, but the deeper understanding required to partner with the mountain itself. "The instruments will tell you what has happened," Jake explained during one of their training sessions. "But the mountain will tell you what is going to happen, if you learn to listen." Marcus's journals from this period document his transformation from confident modern engineer to humble student of forces he was only beginning to understand. The succession system Jake designed was brilliantly conceived to identify individuals who possessed the rare combination of technical skill and intuitive sensitivity needed to continue his work. Each potential keeper had to demonstrate not just the ability to survive at extreme altitude, but the capacity to hear what Jake called the mountain's voice, that subtle communication of environmental changes that separated true mountain dwellers from mere visitors. This tradition continues today. Sarah Chen, the current keeper, is a former NASA engineer who initially approached the mountain as a technical challenge. Like Marcus before her, she discovered that Jake's methods required capabilities that couldn't be taught in any university. Her recent writings describe the ongoing relationship between human consciousness and natural forces that Jake pioneered. We don't preserve the cabin. Jake built it to preserve itself. We're just witnesses to an ongoing conversation between one man's will and the eternal mountain. On December 21st, 1918, the winter solstice, when the mountain's power reaches its peak, Marcus found Jake's body seated at his east window, positioned to catch the first light over peaks he had called home for 26 years. His final journal entry, written that morning in handwriting that remained steady despite his 79 years, read, "The dance is ending, but the music plays on. The mountain has been a gracious partner. I leave my steps in the stone for others to follow, though each must find their own rhythm." The funeral became something unprecedented, a pilgrimage that drew over 500 people from across the country, all attempting the climb that most experienced mountaineers considered dangerous even in perfect conditions. Those who reached the cabin found that Jake had prepared for everything, even his own death. His gravesite had been dynamited from solid granite years before, positioned where it would catch the first light of every sunrise. The man who had spent his life in partnership with the mountain had ensured that even in death, he would remain part of its daily rhythm. Today, Jake's cabin stands exactly as he built it, having survived earthquakes that toppled modern structures in the valleys below, avalanches that redirected around its precisely angled walls, and storms that stripped entire forests bare while leaving his sanctuary untouched. Scientific analysis reveals construction techniques that were decades ahead of their time. Flexible joints that absorb seismic shock, aerodynamic profiles that actually reduce wind load, and material choices that strengthen rather than weaken under extreme stress. The million-dollar restoration attempted in 1995 had to be abandoned when modern engineers realized that Jake's original work surpassed anything they could achieve with contemporary methods. Every improvement they attempted actually weakened the structure's ability to survive in its impossible environment. The mountain had already approved Jake's design through decades of testing. Human hubris couldn't improve on a partnership that had been proven by time and trial. Jacob Thornton's legacy extends far beyond the physical cabin that still stands sentinel at 11,200 feet. He proved that human beings could achieve seemingly impossible adaptation through the marriage of technical knowledge and intuitive wisdom. He demonstrated that survival at extreme limits requires not conquest of natural forces, but partnership with them. Most remarkably, he showed that such partnerships could be sustained not just for seasons or years, but for entire lifetimes. The man who stepped off that train in Granite Falls in 1892 seeking to prove human will could triumph over nature discovered something far more profound. That true triumph comes not from defeating the forces around us, but from learning to dance with them. In that dance, both partners are transformed. The mountain shaped Jake into something beyond ordinary human capability, and Jake, through his impossible persistence and intuitive genius, proved that the mountain could accept a human partner in its eternal conversation with the sky. In the end, Jacob Thornton became what he had always been destined to become, not the conqueror of Mount Desolation, but its most faithful interpreter, translating the mountain's ancient wisdom for a world that had forgotten how to listen to voices larger than human ambition. His echo still resonates in the thin air above 11,000 feet, where those who climb with proper reverence can still hear the music of that eternal dance.